There's some breaking point, and generally that is either, war or some kind of plague, pestilence, or economic collapse. And then there's an opportunity to refound.
Yeah.
But, one of the reasons I'm calling for it now is like, maybe we don't have to wait for that. Maybe we can be proactive.
When things totally break, that's the moment where transformation comes. And you could have a thing where you kind of have this big rebirth and, basically you elect people that finally things change and go in the right direction. The opposite path, like what we saw after Weimar, is that people just want someone to blame. And so you get a monster in charge that feeds on that energy and promises, we're going to give you security. It's not your fault. It's their fault. You blame some group that wasn't involved, and then you have some sort of horrible outcome.
Today we delve into an intriguing concept that intertwines the realms of government, technology, and society. We're discussing a theory with Natalie Smoleski and Lyn Alden. Natalie is a political and economic anthropologist, and Lyn is the author of the book Broken Money. This theory explores the dynamic race between the state and society for technological supremacy and its profound implications on our freedoms. How does this constant competition shape our world? Can liberty truly flourish in this narrow corridor of power balance? And in the age of Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, how does this race influence our financial system and personal freedoms? Join us as we unravel these complex themes and understand why in this digital era, governance and money are more intertwined than ever before.
This is a theory put forward by two political scientists, James Robinson and Daron Acemoglu, to describe what happens when the state and society are in a race for technological supremacy. So, the state makes some moves, and then society makes some moves, and there's this competition that actually improves both state and society over time if the power is balanced. It creates this narrow corridor in which liberty can flourish, because in their theory, liberty is actually a product of the rule of law, but the rule of law that does not function as tyranny. And so, when does law become tyranny? I mean, there's no absolute bright line, but as the corridor collapses, that's when we see tyranny emerge.
Would you argue, therefore, that race is the narrow corridor of liberty in relation to money?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so we're in a race of Bitcoin versus CBDCs right now.
That's right.
That's scary stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are like a frog being boiled slowly. It's almost like we need a rethink of governance in a world which is digital.
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels far too easy for government to take too much control in a digital world.
Fundamental innovation of the Enlightenment era political revolutions was separation of powers. How do you prevent power from just metastasizing? Well, you separate it out and you give different branches of government different functions, and then allow them to check each other's power, and that will keep it in check. What we found is there was some validity to that worked for a time, but over time there ended up being this narrowing sort of revolving door between different branches of government and industry. And so the power of the state has in effect been a shared point of interest among all branches of government. And so I would suggest that the system of checks and balances has broken down in the United States.
When you say it's broken down, like what are the key signals for that breaking down for you?
Things like increasingly legislating through federal agencies, which are the executive branch, instead of through Congress. The federal government currently has we don't know how many federal agencies because there's no actual shared definition of what it is. But each agency has the mandate to create policy in its sort of area of remit. These are organizations not accountable to Congress for the most part, not accountable to the American people. Often they function completely in secrecy. They're political appointees. And so in effect, you have law now routinely being made through the executive branch and judicial collusion, whether it's the 1954 legislation that suspended, in effect, the Fourth Amendment. And so we have a Byzantine bureaucratic system that in effect has created this unaccountable form of executive power, and that is the consolidating state.
So is the state winning the race at the moment?
I would say yes, it is.
And how much would you point to money being as a driving factor behind this?
Well, money is just one mechanism of control, but it's an important one. It's an information technology. So the money is a social institution whose purpose is to facilitate exchange. Well, exchange is another word for communication. The government always has a vested interest in who communicates with whom about what and for what purpose. Until recently, it's not been possible to exercise a certain level of granular control over financial communication between people, but now it is.
And with the CBDC, that would get considerably worse?
Absolutely. Transacting is also now intrinsically tied with verifiable identity. And so it's, in effect, the end of privacy as we know it.
Lyn, how much correlation have you seen between what is breaking in the financial system and the increase in control and kind of weird kind of decisions that are coming from central government?
I think there's a big correlation, and I think there's also arguably an even bigger correlation in the political polarization that happens, because people start to feel that something's broken, but then they can't necessarily put their finger on what's broken, in part because the way the system's designed, it's very opaque. The average person doesn't know what the money supply growth rate is, so they don't know why things are maybe getting more expensive than their wages are keeping up with. They see the wealth concentration happening, but then they differ on why that's happening, right? They don't see like the differing kind of rates of credit that can be made available to different entities and how that can suck kind of value up to the well-connected. And so all this kind of steps along the way, there's just so many opaque things that are happening with the money system that fuels some of the big political issues that then polarizes people. And then they end up kind of talking about the same sort of thing, but in very different language and very different understandings of why this is happening or how to fix it, because the plumbing underneath is complex, it's opaque. And even if you study money, it's hard to figure out.
And are these complexities essentially apolitical? It doesn't really matter who's in power. The same things tend to happen.
Generally speaking, I mean, there's different flavors, but in terms of the money system, you don't see a lot of change from party to party in that sense. They tend to err in certain directions, but really especially in the U.S., but also just elsewhere, the mechanism itself is just kind of perpetuating. So you can make minor changes to that based on how you vote, but the actual structures are going to be different. I think the politics kind of seems to matter more for the social realm, whereas the financial realm changes very slowly.
And so is the social realm really becoming a distraction to the financial realm? I mean, that's a question really for both of you, because I feel like it is.
Some people would argue that that's intentional, that basically those that don't want issues focused on the money divide people to focus on other things. It's hard to say how much that is well crafted, but for example, you see in some kind of campaigns to stir political chaos, you can distract a group to align with you against another thing, even if they're aligning against their own interests.
But this is so complex that how do we even try to communicate this out to a wider audience? Because if democracy is essentially broken, it doesn't really matter who you vote for. And I don't even know, how do you start to communicate these things to people? Because it seems like it's so far and so opaque.
Re-election depends on being able to demonstrate to your constituency that you have done stuff for them. And if you're an elected official, generally that means passing laws. And so you have a set of incentives for officials to just pass stuff, just write laws, pass them, almost regardless of what's in them. But it's more for the optics to show that, I'm out here fighting for you. And so you have a system of torts. Then you have a metastasizing set of government agencies, executive agencies. And all of this is being driven by the short-term career interests of people staffing the machine of the state. And so it's like a downward spiral market dynamic. What you were saying about deficits, spiraling, and people not knowing what to do is you have to reverse the entire vicious cycle. You have to make it a virtuous cycle. How do you do that? By creating an engine of wealth formation, capital formation, and economic productivity. But that is opposite the interests of the people manning the machine of the state who are seeking their career longevity by doing precisely the opposite.
This is the clash of the political cycle and the economic cycle. Or if you have the infinite money printer, this essentially the design of the political system will ultimately lead to economic decline. Is there any examples where it hasn't? I mean, it just feels like, because the state just always grows.
Well, one way I'd phrase it right now is that we're kind of seeing the failure of incrementalism. So a lot of people think if we just get like our person in charge, we can start turning this around. And then that person, either well-intentioned or not, gets eaten by the machine. And the machine just keeps going. And then people say, well, if we only get the next person in charge, we can turn this around. And so all these kind of like small measures are just going against basically the Borg of the bureaucracy of the system of as things are designed. And historically, you tend to see kind of like things go on and on and on and on, and then a gigantic trend change. And that's when it really matters, because that's when you can get either very virtuous outcomes or horrific outcomes. There's stable systems and unstable systems, or marginally stable systems. And the financial system has all of the traits of an unstable. It's because we've kind of extended the system as far as it can go.
Out of bullets.
Yeah, we're out of bullets. And now we're kind of dealing with the consequences of a system that always, for the past, say, 4+ decades or more, was always unstable. But that could be delayed, deferred, pushed onto someone else, often in the developing world.
Yeah.
But now a lot of these things are starting to hit in the present.
So we're there right now.
Yeah, I think we've been there really since the global financial crisis. What's new this time is that most of these kind of long-term debt cycle or institutional cleansing cycle things that we go through, fourth turning, whatever you want to call it, usually there's a changeover in the type of money we use. You go from, say, free banking to central banking with a gold underlay. Then you go to another central banking model where you don't even have a gold underlay anymore. So what comes out, right? We've never gone in this gigantic fiat currency global cycle, have a whole sovereign debt crisis on a global scale, and then see what's on the other side of that. That's new.
There's no precise way to tell what the tipping point is, but when high inflation becomes hyperinflation, that's usually the moment in which the crisis of confidence really spreads beyond the small circle of people who may have been sounding the alarm about it all along. I'm reminded of Weimar Germany when there was high inflation after they went off the gold standard in 1914. But hyperinflation didn't really hit until the end of 1922-23. And that was the point at which farmers stopped accepting the Reichsmark in compensation for their labor, and the country was put on the verge of starvation. Money as law, or the thing that is decreed by the state as legal tender, when people just stop accepting it, that's the point at which there's crisis.
And I would add that it's not even just hyperinflation that can do it. It's the perception of the loss of control.
Right.
And so, for example, there are a lot of developing countries today where they're not in, say, outright hyperinflation. Yeah. They might just have double-digit inflation on a recurring, regular basis. It's like a background part of life. And there's no expectation that they're going to get it under control. And that's kind of the world. That's historically a developing market phenomenon. In fact, I think that's kind of on the train we're going for, is that you can call for kind of a central bank losing control in the sense that there becomes no clear way where they can get it back down to their kind of prior baseline of money supply growth and price level changes and things like that, where there's too much public debt for them to tighten the way they want to. And then the challenge is that when you have a lot of public debt, interest rates start losing their effect. They become more complicated tools to try to slow down inflation compared to when you have lower public debt levels and higher private debt levels. And so when I get questions on hyperinflation stuff and I say, we don't have to be there, the market still generally thinks the Fed can get the current situation under control. And maybe for a few years they can, right? You can cyclically get it under control potentially. We're not there yet, but I think we're on this kind of multi-year process of getting to that point.
And so are you basically saying particularly high double-digit inflation is entirely within the realm of possibility within Western liberal democracy?
I would say within the 2020s, I think. Next few years, perhaps, there's one or two things that's going to happen. Big deflationary collapse, or they're going to print a lot more base money.
Which means inflation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what they did back in 2009, 2008, is they radically increased the base money, and they've been doing it ever since to never let broad money collapse by any significant amount.
So historians have demonstrated how when an empire or civilization is in decline, there's an increasing rate of like stochastic tragedies, conflicts, crime, shortages, like basically the level of ambient chaos in the society rises slowly.
We're seeing an increase of murders in places like New York. We're seeing a massive increase in crime. So we're seeing all those things you've just said.
Mass shootings. I mean, like they're more and more every year. They're very hard to predict. And so, that trend generally continues until there's some breaking point. And generally that is either, war or some kind of plague, pestilence, or economic collapse. And then there's an opportunity to refound. Yeah. But, one of the reasons I'm calling for it now is like, maybe we don't have to wait for that. Maybe we can be proactive.
When things totally break, that's the moment where transformation comes. And you could have a thing where you kind of have this big rebirth and, basically you elect people that finally things change and go in the right direction. The opposite path, like what we saw after Weimar, is that people just want someone to blame. And so you get a monster in charge that feeds on that energy and promises, we're going to give you security. It's not your fault. It's their fault. You blame some group that wasn't involved. And then you have some sort of horrible outcome. And so that's how you can get things like fascism or communism.
The difference between a country spiraling into chaos and prospering is, first of all, in the character of the leadership exercising that violence. So leadership absolutely matters, 100%. But then that leadership's ability to institutionalize the workings of the machine of governance such that they personally are no longer needed. So the sovereign steps back behind the curtain. And people who have grown up in relative peace and prosperity with relatively well-functioning institutions often forget that there's that violence behind the curtain. And so they say things like, why do we even need commodity money? We have a perfectly good state credit money system. But when the curtain gets torn asunder, what emerges?
So we've seen this. What happens there when the dollar fails?
When these major currencies, the dollar, the euro, the yen, when they get such high debt to GDP, when they have all this interest expense, when they run into, say, an energy shortage, a more sustained one, that's when you get these kind of big turning points. And I think if in a world where Bitcoin was never invented, I think the most likely approach would be they would recapitalize with gold, essentially. Obviously, we're in this world where we have Bitcoin. And I think Jeff Booth described it in your podcast. It's like, comes down to a couple questions. Does Bitcoin remain decentralized and secure?
Yes.
Then that is basically a predator towards any currency that is, more controlled, more inflationary. And it stands there kind of still growing and getting stronger.
We have an optimistic end. Thank you. If you are listening and you haven't bought Lyn's book, Broken Money, anywhere you want to send people, anything you want to share, Natalie?
The Texas Bitcoin Foundation is launching our first book, The Satoshi Papers, next year.
It's clear that the race for technological supremacy between the state and society is more than just a power struggle. It's a defining factor in our quest for liberty and the shaping of our financial system. The insights from our guest today highlight the crucial need for balance and vigilance in this ongoing race. Remember, the choices we make and the technologies we embrace have profound implications on our privacy, freedom, and the ongoing evolution of our society. If you want to learn more about how money affects our society, we recommend you watch this video here. Thanks for tuning into our channel tonight. If you learned something, help this video find more people by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more podcast recaps like this every week.